This move establishes central control and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for a flexible development and potential pawn breaks. This move initiates a flexible development that prepares for various Indian defenses, allowing black to choose the exact pawn structure later based on white's intentions. This move establishes central pawn control, preparing to challenge black's knight and potentially develop into a queen's pawn opening or an English opening, aiming for flexible pawn structures and rapid piece development. This move signals a transition into a queen's Indian defense or Nimzo-Indian defense setup for black, aiming to control the d5 square and develop pieces harmoniously. This move develops a knight towards the center, supporting the central pawn structure and preparing for kingside castling, a common continuation in many queen's pawn openings like the queen's Indian defense or Nimzo-Indian defense. Developing the queen's bishop to b7 prepares to exert pressure along the long diagonal and supports a potential queenside pawn advance. This move develops a piece and prepares to support a potential e4 pawn advance, maintaining central influence and flexibility in this queen's Indian setup. This move, bb4, initiates the Bogo Indian defense, aiming to control the center by pinning the knight and potentially creating imbalances later. This move develops the bishop to a more active square and pins the knight to the queen, preparing for potential pressure on black's queenside. Developing the bishop to b7 exerts pressure along the long diagonal towards white's queenside. This move solidly reinforces the center and prepares for further development, solidifying white's control of key central squares and potentially opening lines for the queen. Later on, this move challenges the pinned bishop on g5, seeking to resolve the immediate tension and potentially gain a tempo if white decides to retreat. The bishop. This move, bh4, initiates a common plan in this line of the queen's Indian defense, aiming to exchange the bishop for the knight on f6, which would weaken black's kingside pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's attack. This move clarifies the pawn structure by exchanging a bishop for a knight, a typical positional decision in the Nimzo-Indian defense to potentially create weaknesses in white's pawn formation after white recaptures. This recapture of the bishop with the b-pawn creates a doubled pawn structure for white on the c-file but opens the b-file for the rook and strengthens control of the d5 square. The move d6 solidifies the central pawn chain and prepares to develop the bishop to e7 or d7, avoiding the doubled pawns white now possesses on the c-file. Developing the knight to d2 supports the central pawn push to e4 and prepares to connect the rooks, while also anticipating potential queen transfers to the kingside. This pawn advance creates weaknesses on the dark squares of black's kingside and opens lines for white's pieces, particularly the bishop on g5 and potentially a queen check on h5. This move, bg3, strategically repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the central pawn structure and preparing for potential kingside expansion while also being mindful of white's recent pawn weaknesses. The queen moves to e7, preparing to potentially castle queenside and connect the rooks, while also supporting a possible g4 advance later. This move prepares to challenge black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the a-file, while also restricting the mobility of black's pieces. This move aggressively challenges white's queenside space advantage, aiming to prevent a potential b4-b5 pawn push and create a more solid structure on that flank. This aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside initiates an attack, aiming to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces. potentially targeting the weakened kingside. This move signals white's intention to launch a kingside attack, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure after the pawn exchange in the open h-file. This pawn capture opens the h-file for your rook, creating attacking possibilities against black's kingside, while also potentially weakening black's pawn structure. Opening the h-file strategically weakens black's kingside pawn structure, creating potential targets and opportunities for white's pieces to infiltrate. This move develops the queen to a more active central square, eyeing the weakened dark squares on black's kingside and potentially supporting a future kingside pawn advance or knight maneuver. This move develops the knight to a less active square, potentially allowing white to seize control of the d5 outpost and reinforce their queenside pawn majority. This move prepares to contest the b-file, aiming to activate white's rook and potentially create play against black's queenside pawn structure, while also supporting a future b4 push. This move addresses the king's awkward position after g5 gram4, vacating the f8 square to allow the rook to potentially connect and prepare for castling or centralizing the king. This move is preparing to redeploy the queen to a more active square, likely e2 or f3, to support potential pawn advances on the kingside or to connect the rooks. Black's move 16. bc6 aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a queenside expansion or challenging white's central control after white's queen retreat to d1. The rook moves to h2 to defend the pawn on h4 and prepare for potential queen and rook activity on the kingside or in the center, while also clearing the second rank. The king's flight to g7 is a prudent maneuver, centralizing the monarch and escaping the dangerous open h-file now controlled by white's rook, while preparing for future defensive or offensive coordination. This move initiates a pawn break in the center, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside dark squares and create attacking chances on the open lines. This pawn exchange on c5 opens the b-file for white's rook and creates a significant pawn majority for black on the kingside, but also weakens black's queenside pawn structure. This move challenges the black knight controlling the c5 square, aiming to disrupt black's defensive pawn structure and gain control of key central squares. This move retreats the knight to a passive square, surrendering the d5 outpost and allowing white to consolidate their pawn structure advantage and prepare for an attack on the kingside. This capture opens the d-file for white's queen and rook, creating immediate pressure on black's queenside and challenging the pawn structure. This move forcefully opens the center, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create dynamic play by breaking up black's pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the critical d6 pawn and preparing to support a central pawn push or exploit the open c-file. The black king has been uncomfortably pushed forward and exposed on the g-file. Returning it to f8 offers better protection behind the pawn chain and prepares potential defensive maneuvers. This aggressive rook maneuver aims to exploit white's central pawn advance and create attacking chances on the kingside, while simultaneously supporting potential pawn breaks or piece activity. This move reorganizes the knight to a potentially more active central square, eyeing squares like c7 and supporting a possible breakthrough with e5 if white's structure becomes vulnerable. This move capitalizes on black's compromised kingside pawn structure in the open lines, preparing to launch a decisive attack along the h-file with the rook and queen. This move desperately tries to break white's powerful grip on the center and create counterplay, but it dangerously weakens the kingside and ignores white's immediate threats. This move on Rh7 is an aggressive attempt to exploit the weakened kingside structure created by black's pawn advances, aiming to open lines for a mating attack. This move prepares to defend the kingside by potentially repositioning the knight to g7, creating a defensive shield and allowing the rook to perhaps redeploy to a more active square or bolster the defense. This move aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack while also defending against black's threats and controlling key squares. The move, abandoning its safe position on f8, is an attempt to escape the dangerous discovered attack that would have occurred on e7 after white's next move, but it weakens the king's defenses and allows white to continue its kingside attack. This check forces black's king to a more exposed central square, consolidating white's spatial advantage and preparing to exploit the weakened kingside. The king is forced to repeat its move to avoid immediate material loss after white's discovered check threat, highlighting black's precarious defensive position on the kingside. The move qf3 reiterates white's attempt to find a more active square for the queen, but it's a passive choice that doesn't address black's aggressive kingside pawn push, which has created weaknesses around white's king. Black's king continues its weary journey back to safety, attempting to escape the dangerous pressure white has built up on the kingside. The rook repositions to h6, aiming to occupy the open h-file and apply pressure on the kingside, potentially preparing to sacrifice itself on g7 to expose the black king. This move repositions the knight back to its starting square, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square like f6 or d7, potentially supporting a queenside pawn advance or preparing to meet white's queenside pressure. This central pawn push immediately challenges black's cramped position and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and pressure the d5 pawn. This move pushes the g-pawn forward, aiming to create further defensive complexities for white's king and potentially open lines for black's pieces, while also creating a passed pawn on the g-file if white is not careful. The move qf4 aims to centralize the queen, activate it for potential attacks along the open files and diagonals, and prepare for further pawn pushes or piece development, while also potentially defending against black's aggressive pawn advances. This move eliminates white's active bishop, simplifying the position and aiming to disrupt white's attacking formation, though it gives up the important dark squared diagonal for black's king. This rook sacrifice aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain an open file for the remaining rook to pressure the weakened king. This move activates the knight from its passive defensive square, preparing to contest the central squares and potentially support a kingside attack or reinforce the defense of the king. This move exploits the pinned knight on d7 and the weakened dark squares around black's king, aiming to shatter black's defensive structure and initiate a decisive attack. Black recaptures the pawn, aiming to simplify the position and relieve the pressure on the queenside. But white's active pieces and potential for further pawn breakthroughs still pose significant threats. This move attempts to regain the sacrificed pawn and simplify the position, but it allows black's knight to infiltrate into the center with tempo. This move is a tactical blunder as it loses a piece to a strong discovered attack, ignoring white's powerful discovered attack on the knight. This move is a decisive tactical shot, winning material by exploiting white's advantage in piece activity and the exposed black king. This capture opens the crucial d-file, activating the black rook and creating immediate threats against white's exposed king and potentially leading to tactical complications. This move decisively wins a pawn and exploits black's weakened queenside pawn structure, opening up the position for white's powerful pieces. This move attempts to break open lines for black's pieces by creating a passed pawn on f5. But it weakens the kingside and allows white's pieces to penetrate on the open diagonals. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on c5 and consolidate white's material advantage, while simultaneously blocking the dangerous diagonal for black's bishop. This move activates the queen to a more central square, preparing to potentially capture the pawn on c5 and also defending the knight on d7. While eyeing the weakened kingside, white's queen repositions to d4, reinforcing the central control and preparing to potentially attack the weakened pawn structure on the queenside. The rook on a7 activates onto the semi-open file, contesting control and preparing to support potential pawn advances or even swing over to the kingside. This move is a desperate attempt to force a perpetual check or create counterplay against the black king, leveraging the open files and the exposed enemy monarch, though black has sufficient resources to navigate the immediate danger. The knight's retreat to g7 is a defensive maneuver aimed at reinforcing the kingside and potentially preparing to redeploy to f5, while also defending against the immediate threats posed by white's rook on h7 and queen. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the a-pawn, potentially forcing weaknesses in black's position if they cannot be adequately defended. The king is exposed and under fire. Prioritizing king's safety by returning to the relative security of g7 is essential rather than continuing to advance on the queenside. This queen sacrifice (qxd7) is a brilliant tactical decision that simplifies the position while creating a passed pawn on the a file and an active rook on the h file, aiming to exploit white's uncoordinated pieces and king's safety issues. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, and black must now focus on exploiting the pawn majority on the kingside to create a passed pawn. The rook now drives the knight from the a7 square, preparing to advance its pawn on the queenside and consolidate material advantage. The rook now occupies the d-file, opening lines for potential piece activity and defense of the remaining pawn structure. This move aims to improve white's pawn structure and create potential passers on the queenside by challenging black's control of the d-file and opening lines for white's rook. This move brings the rook into active play on the open d-file, threatening the white king and aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially win material. If the king cannot escape danger, the king must actively participate in the endgame to support the pawn advances and control critical squares. This move seeks to exploit the open c-file and control vital central squares, aiming to coordinate black's rook and knight for an attack on white's king. This move prepares to advance the passed pawn on a6, aiming to create a new passed pawn or disrupt black's coordination, while also controlling key squares. This checking move is a desperate attempt to disrupt white's advancing passed pawn on a6 and potentially create counterplay by forcing the king to move, but it ultimately fails to stop the pawn's promotion. The king must retreat to the corner to avoid the checks and prepare for defense or potential counterplay. The move 45, Ra2 aims to exploit the open file on the a-file and target white's potentially exposed pawns, while also potentially preparing to support a future pawn advance or centralize the rook. This move prepares to double rooks on the b-file, creating significant pressure along that open file and potentially attacking black's remaining pawn. On b6, the move prepares to bring the rook from the back rank into a more active position on the queenside, potentially supporting a pawn advance or attacking weak points on the c-file. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, which could become a significant advantage if black cannot adequately blockade or capture it. This move introduces a forcing check to disrupt white's attacking coordination and aims to capitalize on the open files and potential weaknesses created by white's recent pawn push on the queenside. The king must retreat to the safer central file to avoid further checks and prepare for potential endgame scenarios. This check forces white to maintain the defensive structure and prevents immediate king escape on the queenside. The game has transitioned from a queen's pawn opening into a sharp tactical battle where white's queenside majority has been countered by black's kingside activity. And after a series of exchanges and aggressive pawn pushes, the king is forced back into a more active, though potentially vulnerable, central position. This move offers a pawn to create a passed pawn on the g-file, aiming to distract white's pieces and potentially open lines for black's remaining forces. This pawn capture opens the f-file for the rook, activating it towards the black king and aiming to exploit the vulnerable pawn structure after black's g-pawn advance. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the g-file after recapturing, hoping to exploit the open lines and potential queen activity that arises from the recent exchanges. The king is being brought into a more active central position to support the remaining pawns and potentially participate in the endgame. The pawn sacrifice aims to activate the rook on g2 and create immediate threats against white's king, potentially leading to complications or a passed pawn on the g-file. This move aims to regroup the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepare to contest the open c-file after black recaptures on g3. The rook now attacks the 7th rank, creating threats against white's king and preparing to exploit any weaknesses that arise from the queen's repositioning. This move pushes the passed c-pawn to a more advanced square, aiming to restrict black's pieces and potentially create mating threats or force material concessions. This move aims to exploit the open file on the a-file, preparing to support the advance of the passed pawn on c6 and potentially create mating threats against the white king. This move offers a timely repositioning of the rook, creating threats along the 3rd rank and preparing for potential checks or attacks on the black king. This move aims to activate the f-pawn, creating immediate threats and potential complications against white's king, while also preparing to support a potential pawn push or recapture after further exchanges. This move aims to exploit the exposed black king by preparing to advance the passed pawn on the c-file, potentially creating a decisive passed pawn or opening lines towards the king. The move 55, kf5 aims to activate the king, bringing it closer to the center to potentially participate in the fight for the remaining pawns and defend against white's encroaching pieces, especially after the rook sacrifice that opened up lines. This check forces black's king to move, allowing white to maintain the initiative and potentially set up further attacks or material gains. With the active rook, this move aims to consolidate the pawn majority in the center and create a central passed pawn, but it allows white's rook to penetrate further along the 7th rank, potentially creating threats against the black king. This move aims to secure the pawn on a6 and prepare for potential pawn advancement, while also keeping the rook on the 4th rank to support its king. This move aims to solidify the pawn structure and potentially prepare for a later central advance, or to support the queen's repositioning to a more active square, considering the exposed king position. This move advances the passed pawn, aiming to force a promotion and create a decisive advantage by exploiting the opponent's compromised king safety and lack of defensive resources. The pawn push creates a passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially force exchanges that would simplify into a more favorable endgame for black.